and it's meaningful by aiming at something. What it aims at is either a telos or an eschaton, and they're different, but they're both ends. And without that directedness, there is no meaningful history, which means there's no history. So just to say something on those 2 points very briefly, events, eventfulness, events that's a big topic in contemporary philosophy, and it has something to do with this breakthrough to history, but for the purposes of this talk, events surprise, that is, they're not reducible to what preceded them. And they also fulfill, that is, they make sense of what preceded them. And they point ahead to something which will both surprise and fulfill in the similar way in which it has surprised and fulfilled what preceded it. So events make history narratable. It makes history a story. So I trust it's clear that a series of sequences are not events. They just happen to follow each other, but they have no intrinsic relation to each other. T1 is not intrinsically related to T2 and T3 in a bare series of successions. But a series of events narrated historically are meaningful and related to one another. The second presupposition maybe you find a little bit more problematic. Does history have to be meaningful? This, I think, is probably a difficult one for us because we seem to be comfortable with the idea of history and comfortable with the idea of a meaningless universe. But I'm going to stick with this one. Local occurrences of meaning are swallowed up by the meaninglessness of the whole. If the whole has no meaning, then the local is not really meaningful. And what I mean by this is your cosmologist goes home and he really believes everything will be swallowed up by heat death in a kind of meaningless accidental end to the meaningless accident which is the universe. But he kisses his wife and he sits down to his pot roast and he bounces his baby on his knee. And all of this is meaningful to him locally. And he says that this is enough for him. And what I'm saying is that it isn't, because in fact, if he thought the matter through, there's nothing particularly meaningful about his relation to his wife, or his home, or his child, or the love that he feels for the family. The whole thing is swallowed up in an abyss of meaninglessness. Of course, Nietzsche said as much on the uses and abuses of history in his Untimely Meditations, where he argued that the only way to do history is by lying. Because if we really saw things as they were, we would have to say, there is really nothing meaningful, there are no meaningful events, there is no real history in the ontological sense of the word. There's only going to be cherry picking for certain purposes. So you cherry pick properly or improperly. It's more or less the theme of that essay. The other figure, everything going all right here with this thing?
I'm actually using the microphone on the camera. Something's going on with the mic, so.
Good, so I'll get rid of it then.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
The other figure is Karl Löwit, who in 1949 wrote a very influential book called Meaning in History, where he examined just this thesis that history is eventful time and it's meaningful time, or it isn't. And we didn't always think this way about history, but we began to think about this way about history in the Middle Ages, in European Christendom, which gave rise to the great narrative of modernity, which launches the revolutions in science and in politics, which produced the modern world and the cult of progress. And all of that works pretty well until we get to the middle of the 20th century, when it all seems to be some kind of fiction that we've created. And at that point, we're stuck with a commitment to historical time, eventful time. So we can't go back to the cyclical universe of the Greeks or some kind of atemporality of the ancient world. We're stuck with eventful time, but we no longer have telos or eschaton. We no longer have meaningful time, and the end result, according to Löwit, is nihilism. So these are just two places where we find these presuppositions articulated outside of Schelling. Now, Schelling didn't always pursue this thought. He was not always a philosopher of history. He became a philosopher of history in 1809 in a clumsy fashion, we could say, in an exploratory fashion, in a confused fashion, deliciously confused, the Freedom essay is. And he really found his foothold in the topic in his lectures on the positive philosophy, which was the culmination of his career in 1831, at which point he endeavored to construct a philosophy of history that would supplant Hegel's. So up until then, he avoided the whole thing. And this is something that I think is important, and I want to go into it in some detail. He avoided the whole thing, and this was Schelling 1. Schelling 1 avoided the whole thing by being an idealist in the strict sense of the term. And for Schelling, an idealist in the strict sense of the term is one who pursues a purely rational philosophy to its logical culmination, which is the denial of eventful time. And he thinks that you see such denials in Plato and Plotinus, and he certainly develops them over the course of thousands of pages of pursuing this thesis. How did he get there? So a little brief run up to Schelling's mature idealism through his nature philosophy. He became very famous as a young man for writing treatises on nature, one treatise after another, and they earned the recognition of many people, including Hegel, who wrote his first book on Schelling's nature philosophy, and Goethe, who said, "This is so amazing, get this guy a job." So he became the youngest professor, I think, in the history of Germany up until recently, at the University of Vienna, because of his work on nature philosophy. And the project in nature philosophy was to counteract the dualism of modern philosophy. The dualism of modern philosophy, which you're familiar with, standard undergraduate stuff, that we can divide the world into subjects who are free, and spiritual, and immaterial, and objects which are necessary and material and over and against us. And on this side we have spirit, and on this side we have nature. Schelling weighed in on this debate. Whether or not this is accurately Cartesian or not is of no significance. It's simply the way we thought about it in the 18th century, and lots of us did. So Schelling weighed in on this debate, and he said there's something really wrong with this. And this was the Romantic Schelling who enthused about the infinity of nature, who loved the wilderness and so on and so forth, and discovered his unconscious, and fell in love repeatedly, and all of that romantic stuff. Nature couldn't be just some spiritless, mechanical thing over and against free subjectivity. It had to have some of its own integrity. This is not a thought unique to Schelling. All the Romantics argued this. They were all pals. They were in and out of each other's beds. Novalis, the Schlegel brothers, Carolina Schlegel, whom Schelling stole from his friend August Schlegel, married her. So they were all into this stuff. They had salons, and they listened to Beethoven and talked about nature, the infinity without, which is reflective of the infinity within, and so forth. But Schelling, being the smart fellow he was, made it a logical point, and his thesis was the following: that if we properly understand these two things, we can say spirit equals nature, but not in a simple tautological sameness. Rather, to use a biological term, they are stereoisomers. They are like mirror images of each other. Everything that's on the left on the one side is on the right on the other side, like two hands, which are similar but reversed. And Schelling got very specific about what's reversed here. Or as he would put it, and he put it in many ways, but the way that's most helpful for us is that what's implicit in spirit is explicit in nature. And what's implicit in nature is explicit in spirit, sort of kind of play of inside and outside. In the more famous formulation, he said that spirit is invisible nature, and nature is visible spirit. Of course, we could talk for a long time about that, but think basically about ideality. So I know the properties of plants. They take up residency in my soul, to speak in an Aristotelian fashion. But those properties of plants, the essences of plants, they're not on the surface of the plant. In the metaphysical sense, these essences are what's most concealed and most interior in the material beings and natural beings. So that hidden interiority of the natural being becomes the exterior of the mind. It's what's most visible in a certain way to mind, which doesn't mean to say that it has a material visibility. It's not materially visible, but it's what's most on the surface. And similarly, the spirit is not entirely transparent to itself, but beneath it is churning with all of the forces which are visibly manifest in nature, contraction and expansion, drive and struggle and strife. All of this is the deep ground of spirit, which is, of course, the unconscious. And this was the beginning of the concept of the unconscious. So you have this reversed image. A small little detour for the Hegelians in the room. Hegel loved this. He said, this is great, objective idealism. We're finished with subjective idealism. For Fichte, the subjective idealist, nature is some thing thrown out over and against me, which is necessary for me to receive, to activate myself as spirit. Spirit is nothing really other than overcoming these oppositions. So on an epistemological level, the scientist bumps up against the thing he doesn't know, and then reduces that thing that he doesn't know to himself by exposing it to be an intelligible structure. Or on a political level, we go into the Amazon and we find this wild, uninhabitable space, and we cut down the trees and we create roads and streets and make it habitable. Nature, that object, for Fichte, the subjective idealist, is thrown up over and against us for the sake of our own freedom. That was Fichte, and Hegel found that too subjectivistic. But there was something about Schelling's solution which Hegel will go on to find, which Hegel goes on to find too romantic and irrationalistic. Because if you can see in this equivalence game, it's not clear what happens to reason in a robust sense, reason in the full sense of the term, not the understanding which is abstract and reflective, but reason which is comprehensive, which transcends its limits in recognizing them. So Schelling was to be praised for seeing in nature some kind of inchoate spirit, or as he would call it, petrified intelligence, but he was to be corrected for making it some kind of equivalence to reason, such that we weren't really able to say that reason has some kind of preeminence in this relationship, or that spirit in its true sense must be understood as prior to nature, even if in the temporal sense nature becomes prior to spirit. See, Schelling creates this possibility of a natural history of reason which is fully materialistic. And he would say that's actually a good account as well, as good an account as its reverse. So this kind of equivocation was no good. So Hegel restored the hierarchy and said nature is the medium of spirit. Nature is the middle moment, that moment of particularity and asunderedness, which invites spirit further to affirm a true universality, a concrete universality, a rich unity that includes difference within it, or a rich sense of rationality which does not deny like the intelligence of feeling and the sublimity of nature and the intelligibility of the world in its own qualified sense. So there's a restoration of the hierarchy in Hegel to correct young Schelling's enthusiasm for this equipoise. Now, Schelling does not go this direction. Where he goes is in a very surprising direction into what he calls identity philosophy. And this occupies him intensely for close to a decade. And the thesis of identity philosophy is the following. All relations are oppositional. So opposition is not just restricted to certain kinds of relations, but every relation is oppositional. So the relation of a singular existent to its essence is an opposition. The existent is singular, the essence is universal, the existence is incommunicable, the essence is distributed, so on. The relationship of a subject to its predicate is oppositional. All relations are oppositional. Further, oppositions are only possible between two of the same kind. You can't oppose two things that aren't occupying the same logical space. Otherwise, you just have alternative universes that are not interacting. And further, this common kind cannot be oppositional. So this is the familiar image we get in the freedom essay, which the class that I'm teaching now knows all about because we go to it every day, where A equals B stands for any oppositional structure. It could be the subject and its objects in an intellectual sense. It could be the political agent and its ends. It could be the subject and its predicate in the propositional sense. So wherever we're saying something is something else, we have this structure of identity and difference. That is, there's not a tautology, there are two things that are being identified which are different. And the question is, how is that possible? Which is a very old question, of course. And Schelling says it's only possible because of a concealed ground, which isn't a mediator. It's a concealed ground. There is some X, he says, which is in one respect A, and is in another respect B, which allows us to identify the two, even though they're different. Well, the question then becomes, what is this X? It cannot be in the oppositional relationship to what's on the surface. It can't be another opposite. It can't be opposed to this, because then it would have, clearly it couldn't be identified with it. It couldn't ground it, and similarly it can't be opposed to B. And it can't be opposed to other hidden grounds either. So we couldn't say, for example, C equals D, some other instance, by means of some hidden mediator Y, because then we'll ask the question about X and Y, and we end up infinitely reproducing these grounds. So the X has to be undifferentiated, simple, singular, without parts, without relations. This sounds like F.H. Bradley because it is, because F.H. Bradley is repeating Schelling. It is the absolute, the unconditioned. By the absolute, we don't mean the God of heaven and earth, but that which has no conditions because it has nothing it could be related to. It's related to nothing. And of this absolute, we can say certain things. We can say it's never an object. It's not cognized in the ordinary way in which we cognize things. It can only be immediately apprehended in what he called an intellectual intuition, which really meant you don't have to go outside yourself to see it, like a sensible intuition, because it's you in some deep, deep sense. So the full it's very difficult to say what this is, but the intuition of yourself is the intuition of the absolute, properly understood. It is the apprehension of it is the dissolution of subject-object, so this cannot be articulated in any kind of propositional form, and it's not an item of knowledge in that sense. So subject-object distinction disappears, ordinary cognition dissolves. Here's a sentence I just read the other day. Cognizance of the absolute in the objective genitive sense is cognizance of the absolute in the subjective genitive sense. That is, cognizance of the absolute as an object is in fact the absolute's cognizance of myself. The eye with which I see God is the same eye with which God sees me, as Meister Eckhart puts it. So the subject is not seeing anything, really. It is the absolute that is intuiting itself. Now all of this sounds very Zen-like, and it really is. It really is. And there's so much work to be done here on the relationship of this form of Schelling's thinking to Eastern thought, particularly Advaita Vedanta in India, and to Mahayana Buddhism in its Zen variety. So for example, clearly he's prescribing some kind of negation of ordinary patterns of cognition, which doesn't bring us to some special place, but brings us here and now in some much richer, more real sense of the word, which affects the dissolution of ordinary patterns of cognition. And among these ordinary patterns of cognition, we must include the cognition of time. So there's a time dissolves for the subject that becomes cognizant of the absolute and thereby no subject. The absolute, however, is not the union of opposites. It's not the Hegelian third. And this is what Hegel made fun of in the introduction to the Phenomenology of Spirit. It is the night in which all cows are black, as the passage goes. Of it nothing can be said. And Schelling draws this really interesting diagram here, which in one respect, repeats the the nature philosophy, and in other respects, adds something to it. It's called his magnetic diagram, and Hegel discusses it in his Differenzenschaft. So here you sort of have this, right? Because you can see that these two are the same, but they're reversed. So what is positive here is negative here, and what is positive here is negative here. Or if you like, what is explicit here is implicit here, and in potency, and what is explicit here and in act is implicit here and in potency. And we could say that's spirit and nature, or the real and the ideal. And we have our nature philosophy. But then he said something, he added something to this, and he said, the X, which underlies it, is absolute identity. This absolute identity is not the union of opposites. It doesn't bring these things together. It is their point of indifference. It is indifferent to all the opposites to which it gives rise. And that's a technical term. That means it's not different from those things which are different from each other. Differences then become merely apparent. Relations are illusory. There is no sequence, really. There is no time. There is no plurality. There are no events. And we return to Parmenides, a Parmenidean monad. And that's where Schelling more or less was around 1804, 1805. I'm not sure when the big change happens. In 1806, he moves to Munich, and he befriends Franz Baader, and he starts having seances. It's true, they were occultists. And he gets very involved in Jakob Böhme, which wasn't news to him because he was raised in a speculative pietist household. He knew all about speculative pietism. But now he wakes up to it. He finds it very interesting. He writes his father and says, send me your Böhme books. And he writes the Freedom Essay, which is some kind of conceptual metaphysical presentation of Jakob Böhme's theosophy. Jakob Böhme is a 17th century shoemaker, Lutheran shoemaker, who wrote these extraordinary revelations that became foundational for the German language and for German speculation. He invented terms like Abrun and Grun because he had no Latin to turn to. He was an autodidact, absolutely fascinating figure. Hegel was very interested in him as well, they all were. So this was not unique to be reading Böhme. So 1806, 1807, he's reading Böhme. 1809, he writes the Freedom Essay. And somewhere in there, the turn occurs. And that is the turn to real time, or meaningful time, or eventful time, which is history. And the question is this: why does he turn to history? And the answer is surprisingly commonplace, if not profound. Is that possible to have a profound commonplace? At least familiar. If there's no history, then there's no moral responsibility. But there is moral responsibility. Therefore, there must be history. And here, Kant becomes extremely important to him, particularly the Kant who speaks of this performative logic of testifying to moral responsibility, the performance of freedom, saying thank you to somebody, making promises, in spite of the fact that you have no theoretical justification for thinking yourself of being capable of promising. You nonetheless cannot reasonably deny in your actions that you are. You might think, oh, why can't you be morally responsible where there's no history? Well, very simply because if there's no history, then there's no individuals who are capable of promising things and writing contracts and breaking them and so on. We're in a Parmenidean monad where there is no sense of holding anybody accountable for anything because there's no individuality either. As Schelling said, at this stage, there are no essential differences, only quantitative differences. Really strange idea. That things are not qualitatively different from each other, but they're only quantitatively different. But there's more, like you turn up the bass on the one side and the treble on the other side, you get different kinds of beings, spirit and nature. But you don't get individuals who are responsible for themselves, who are morally accountable and capable of free actions. So then, and since we cannot deny moral responsibility, there must be history. But the question then becomes, what is the ontological status of the historical? Because up until now, we have no terms by which to invest the historical with the dignity of being real. At least Schelling has no terms. And he explores various options. He looks at emanation because he's such a dedicated Neoplatonist at this time. And emanation won't do, because that which emanates from the one is really only apparently real. It's really just the infinite in some kind of illusory form. It doesn't have a self-standing. Whatever reality it has by virtue of its origin and that from which it emanates. But it has no reality in itself. And so for Plotinus, I think correctly understood, there's no history in the eventful sense. Schelling was also unimpressed by the standard Orthodox Jewish Christian argument that the historical is part of creation, which is created ex nihilo by God and set free from God so that things can happen. The reason he doesn't like this argument is that it doesn't explain anything. And there certainly is a conundrum. What is the ontological status of creation such that it could be something other than God? This is a scholastic problem, not an easily solved one. And there's a tendency to relapse back into some kind of Neoplatonic sense of saying, well, the reality of creation is really God, and the difference in creation is just apparent. Eckhart more or less says this, that nothing is really happening. It's all just God, which of course leaves us with an inexplicable sense of moral responsibility. So the first solution he shot for in 1809 was creatio ex Deo, which is a doctrine of creation, but not out of nothingness, rather out of God's self. And the argument is complicated, and we won't go into it, but God releases some aspect of himself into independence from him, such that the creation has an ontological status, but yet one that is different from God. It's free of God. This is the whole theme of the freedom essay, that God grounds creation does not preclude the possibility that creation is free. You know, it only would so if you understood antecedents and consequence to be tautological or something, where the antecedent could not be truly followed by something different, which would be denied consequence. So if God is the antecedent and creation is the consequence, there's no reason really why creation couldn't be considered to be free. But we would have to understand it differently than ex nihilo, because we need to have some place, we have some source for the positive being of creation. And this source is God's ground, the grund, the unground, or the ground of God, which is in God but other than God. This solution is closely related to Schelling's enthusiasm for the timaeus. The ground is the aparon, or the unlimited, that which mixed with the form allows for the plurality. So this unlimited is this sort of dark infinity within the divine personality, which grounds the divine personality, which is given some kind of autonomous life outside of itself for the sake of there being something really other than God. That's his solution in 1809. In the ages of the world, Schelling begins working on a full-blown account of real history. And it goes very badly. And he doesn't get very far into it. He really fails miserably to create something that could even come close to rivaling Hegel's phenomenology of spirit. It's a torso. He doesn't publish it. He starts it over and over and over again. He continues hammering away at it over and over and over again, finally abandons the whole thing. But just to give you a sense of what it's all about, he moves from this dyadic model to a triadic model, because of course there has to be a third. And he speaks of these three potencies. He calls them A1, A2, A3, where A1 is now the negative, and A2 is the positive, and A3 is the positive and the negative. the union of opposites that was missing before. And this doesn't have to be understood in some kind of esoteric way. This is pure potency without actuality, pure actuality without potency. Both are abstractions, neither can exist. Anything that really exists is in some ways in potency, in other ways in actuality. So this for Schelling then becomes the interior of God's mind, which is in a rotation around itself, since no potency has any standing over any other. They each have equal claim to occupy logical space. There's no hierarchy. You could call it the trinity of equal relations. And for creation to occur, one of them has to be cut loose. A decision happens, and the decision causes something very weird to happen, which is the first potency emerges into some kind of unjustifiable independence, and it becomes B, creation. That's where he was trying to go with the ages of the world. He found some very interesting parallels to this in the history of religion, particularly in the Lurianic Kabbalah, the idea of God's infinity being too much for creation to exist, and so that the initial act of creation has to be a contraction of God's being or a negation of God. God negates himself, withdraws from the scene, so that there can be that space in which something other than himself can occur. And that withdrawal, or tzimtzum, is this decision, this unfathomable free decision by which God makes something other than himself. So he dropped that language by the end. And now let me just briefly segue to the end by means of another question. The question then becomes, well, let's just say this actually happened, because there's moral responsibility. Why did it happen? Because Schelling is not an obscurantist. He wants satisfactory reasons. So why did this occur? Why does the absolute cause or permit this? And the solution that he strikes upon in 1809 is wonderful. The answer is, he does it so that something in particular might exist, not just something other than him, because evil is other than him, and he's not so thrilled by that. Something specifically good might exist, which could not exist if he was the only game in town, and that is love. Love, which Schelling understands technically, not sentimentally, as a certain kind of union between two that really could be apart, do not need each other to exist, but in fact are not apart and are really one. Love is impossible in a Parmenidean monad. Love is impossible in a universe in which only the infinite exists. But it becomes possible in a universe in which there is something other than God that can take account of itself and respond. And so that's more or less his 1809 answer. Now, we don't stop there. This is where things get interesting, and probably where I'll start being more schematic. This idea that creation is for the sake of love is not a new idea. It's in fact the logic of the New Testament. I don't mean that Jesus comes so that we can love each other. I mean, it's the logic of the New Testament as the church fathers understood it when they understood Jesus to be the incarnation of the Father who comes into the world so that he can respond adequately to the Father, which we apparently can't do. And the love relationship between the Father and the Son, now incarnated and identified with humanity, with creation, becomes the meaning of history. And it wasn't done once and for all. We're on the way there, which is also the New Testament. It happens there's an inaugural ground zero in 1 AD or 33 AD, because it is the crucifixion and the resurrection. And that ground zero throws us towards a future unification of the diversity of being permitted by the absolute, a unification which will not be at the expense of any of the freedom and diversity which has flourished, but will be by means of it. Here Schelling doesn't say he understands how this is going to work. He just argues that that is the promise. That is what we're working towards. So when Schelling turns to the New Testament, he finds there a story which argues that history is the revelation of God and nothing else. So history is not the account of kings and queens or the rise and fall of civilizations. All those are partial moments. History is the revelation of God. That is, God creating something other than himself so that he might be revealed in it. And that revelation, Schelling ventures in his most unpopular argument, is not a possibility, but a fact. It's happened. And the recognition of the fact is no longer a matter for faith, but it is a matter for reason. For reason historically reconfigured in a new key where it has become adequate to the revelation. And this has been happening all throughout modernity, because modernity itself is nothing other than the product of this event. And it's for this reason that Christianity is the last religion. In the same way that Hegel argues it's the last religion, it is the apex of religious history, and it will extinguish itself. It extinguishes itself. Here you there's some proto-Gauchet. It is the religion pour la sortie de la religion. Because Christianity is intrinsically self-secularizing. It's not an accident that it produces modernity, French revolutions, charters of rights and freedoms, the emancipation of women. On the contrary, this is the proper outcome of the event. So our reason is, in fact, becoming adequate to it. And when it does become fully adequate, we will no longer need the obscure mediation of the meaning of history through scholasticism and church theology and so on. So that would be philosophical religion. He thinks it's coming. He doesn't think he's achieved it, but he's laying the groundwork for it in his final lectures. And that's what I've got for you today. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much. We'll open it up for questions. Okay, Peter, go ahead.
Yeah, the event will happen and somebody else will with you. Thanks, Sean. As usual, you showed that Schelling, who's a notoriously opaque figure for somebody who can actually be understood. And I think there is something like an invention of history. And I do agree that the Freiheit essay in particular is an invention or something, invention, discovery, we can see, of an eventual thinking of time, right? That I don't think eschatological time, teleological versions of time have. And the eschaton is eventual, I think, because it's a coming from the outside. But in a sense, it's a futural, and then the past is an eventual. Whereas the past is eventual for Schelling, right? Because of the decision, right? Which has a cut before and after, therefore, right? There's that China, and so there's that decision. But why? There's a tautology in the beginning of that, and I just want you to move it through. I get that history has to be meaningful. Everybody who writes after Heidegger and so on agrees on that. And that's why the critiques of Hegel is that there's a pre-given meaning to history, right? That has to be presumed in order for us to make this narrative to work, right? That's a critique of Heidegger, of Hegel, that's a critique of Derrida, of a certain simplified Hegel for those Hegelians in the room, and so on, right? But then the tautology is without history nor moral responsibility. And I go, no, that's not the case. I can have eventual thinking of time.
No, history is eventual thinking of time.
Yes, I know that.
So right? Without eventual thinking of time, no moral responsibility. That would be the proposition.
And right, and vice versa. Without any moral responsibility, there can't be an eventual thinking of time because moral responsibility requires decisions and freedom, and therefore events.
And imputability, accountability.
And accountability.
That you really did that terrible thing or that wonderful thing.
Right.
You know, it wasn't just the absolute sort of making a shadow picture on the wall.
Right. It's not a determinant.
Yes.
Something like that. Yeah. Walk me through that because
it's simple.
I think.
As Kierkegaard said, the moment has decisive significance. Have you read the Philosophical Fragments? It's a wonderful text where Kierkegaard compares the logic of history Christian history with Socratic time. And he says, well, the moment of recollection disappears into eternity because you're recollecting what you already knew. But the moment when you answer the call, whatever it is, or keep your promise if you like, doesn't disappear into some eternal past. It has, as he says, decisive significance. It is a singularity which is intelligible of its own, not because it repeats something or it's. So this is a kind of voluntarist argument, if you like. It's a really very big, robust metaphysical voluntarism, which would say that singulars are the real thing, but the singulars are issue not just atoms or something, but individuals acting in time.
I think what I was trying to get was this sort of the line of thinking that led us from history has to be always already meaningful or it won't be history, which fine is Hegelian and Schellingian, to evental history, which is disruptive and it's without a timeline. And therefore, to be an event, right, a true event, is not to have a pre-given meaning, right? But
thanks. No, I like this. Yeah, but this is where we get into conflict with contemporary event theory.
Right.
Yeah,
so that's what I'm trying to think.
So I think for Schelling, the heat death is not an event. It's without meaning.
No.
Nothing leads to it, and it doesn't fulfill anything. It's simply
present.
It's just the last in a series of unconnected nows, or nows that are connected efficient causally, which might be. I'm sure it's enough for Jay, but for those of us who want a more deeper sense of significance, we would like to know that there's more than efficient causality.
No, that I get.
Bringing things about,
okay.
right?
Okay. Anyway, though, that's good. That's thanks for clarifying.
Peter.
You seem to have led us right up to the sort of the threshold of the philosophy of revelation,
Yes.
but you haven't said anything about that. I realize that it's quite a lot to be said, but do you want to say a few words about how Schelling proceeds from this point on?
I could say a couple things. There's some very interesting logical moves there. It's not unrelated to the talk that Steve gave on dialectic of the limits, for example. So Schelling will say, okay, there's two types of philosophy. One is negative philosophy, and there's no history for it, and it's idealism, and I perfected it, and Hegel bungled it. And the other is positive philosophy, which is the philosophy of history. And these two have very different methodologies. But the negative philosophy is the presupposition of the positive philosophy, because the negative philosophy is the full philosophy of reason. This is reason's philosophy. This is the pure rational philosophy. So the concepts articulated in the negative philosophy are deployed in the positive philosophy, but in a very curious way, because the transition from the negative philosophy to the positive philosophy cannot be a logical transition. If it was a logical transition, we would still remain within the negative philosophy. All the moves within negative philosophy are logical moves. So this is an answer to the question of how you set your limits. So you can't set your limits from within negative philosophy. From within negative philosophy, there are no limits, which is why the dialectic of the limits is articulated by Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel is correct. There are no real limits, logically speaking. And nonsense is not a real limit, it's just the absence of logic. So from within. So how do you set this limit? And this is the interesting bit. It seems that Schelling has to produce a new kind of logic to articulate this transition. And it's my contention that he invents abduction at that moment to explain this move. He doesn't call it abduction, but Peirce will, and it'll become popular as the logic of hypothesis formation. But by calling abduction, we shouldn't be confused into thinking it's a kind of logical move in the negative sense, because the abduction hinges entirely on the decision of a person who chooses to name his universe in a certain way. And the facts that he names are the ones that need to be explained by the abduction. So if your universe has something in it called love, then the materialist account is not going to do it abductively. And if you wish to go forward with your materialism, you're going to have to say there's no such thing as love, which is precisely what Dawkins said. That what you call love is just selfishness in a different form. But if your universe has something in it called love, then you're going to need a different kind of thinking about things than what you've been working with hitherto. You need an account of the whole which will be adequate to it. And that account hinges in a very strange way on this decision that you made to name your universe as one populated by a phenomenon called love. It wasn't logic that told you that. Somehow you ventured yourself there. This, I think, is the beginning of the existentialism, right? I will to be the citizen of a universe in which there's something called love. Which doesn't mean to say it's arbitrary, but it does mean to say that the universe doesn't give us its names so easily. Or as Jim Bradley used to say to me, that the facts don't solve the issue, the facts are the issue. What are the facts? And don't tell me that you're measuring them with a device, because you aren't. The facts really are a much more complex kind of interpretive venture to give names to being. And those names create puzzles. And so, yeah, I would go somewhere there. But so Schelling wants to recast, the Christian dogma as explanatory answers to abductive problems.
So why sorry, just a small supplementary. Why isn't Christianity just another religion? Why does it hold this special place in Schelling's later view?
Well, here Schelling is really not innocent of that European colonial attitude, which we see, of course, in Hegel and others. He really thinks that something unique has come to birth in the modern age, out of medieval Christendom into modern Europe. He doesn't believe, so the first point is that none of that would have happened without the fact of Christianity. That's one thing he wants to say. That Christianity is a fact, you've got to explain it. You can't just ignore it. And it's intimately bound up with things that moderns hold very near and dear. So that's, if you like, the fact that leads to the abduction that Christianity is the last religion. But I mean, we'd have to do some more steps there, or something like that.
We have Adam and then Carla.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. Would you mind just clarifying this distinction? I remember you saying, called Schelling a consistent thinker, but he does obviously change. He never the system is never complete. But the movement between, I think you called him a dyadic thinker in the Freedom Essay, while he becomes a more triadic thinker in Age of the World.
No, dyadic in the identity philosophy.
And the identity, okay. Can you see that as early, I mean, already in the Freedom Essay, this reinscription of the Timaean discourse with, there's already a third.
Oh, definitely.
McGrath.
Yes, the Freedom Essay is the first introduction of the triad. Although he has, his intimations of it earlier on and so on.
So could you say though, I mean, with the spirit as invisible nature, nature invisible spirit, these are sort of these dyadic movements as he's speaking to the working Kantian to its limits, that he's already expressing, although not explicitly, this third movement, which in the Timaeus, he's working on the intelligible sensible distinction, happens to arrive at a third. He cannot proceed further without movement into the third. So is Schelling already a triadic thinker from the get-go? That was
well, he probably would say he was.
Okay.
But that's one of the reasons he created such puzzles, because he kept saying, well, I've been thinking this all along. And you open the books and you see that that's not what he was thinking all along. There's no way that that's true. So this rich sense of this triadic structure, the three potencies, I don't see it before 1809. Others do. What you do see is someone continually saying, this is not a third. That's where he likes to harp on. And then, so you get the kind of, and I think dyads have this quality that they always issue into the ineffable, because what's withheld is the explanation, or that which could unite things, right? So I think he's well, Franz von Baader said he was a dyadic thinker in the nature philosophy. He denied it, but that's what I see happening there. And that also explains why when he speaks about potencies in the nature philosophy, he speaks about them in such a different way. He speaks about like endless series of potencies, not just A1, A2, A3, but like 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Without this ordered relation, which becomes so predominant, particularly in the age.
Thanks so much, Sean. My question is related to Peter's follow-up about why Christianity has to be the religion here and why it's not a religion like any other. Of course, I think the answer is something in like the metaphysics of Christ, but kind of putting that on pause for a second and kind of spinning the question more positively, I would say for those in the room skeptical of Christianity and the Christian answer and going all the way with Christ and Revelation, how can we frame Schelling's positive philosophy through the concepts you presented, so eventful time, meaning in history, freedom, moral responsibility, in such a way that there's a decisive point then where the person open to these concepts and open to religion can say, I'm going to take Judaism, or I'm going to take Buddhism, or I'm going to take some esoteric mix instead, and I'm still with Schelling, but I'm not a disciple. So
And
we're
you have to be able to
okay.
do that. Because
Point,
that's,
exactly.
that's what he says. Everybody will come to this church of their own accord through their own traditions.
Yeah, and he says
Yes.
his positive philosophy,
Yes.
if you don't want to accept it, that's
Yeah.
actually fine with me. You have to accept rationality and negative philosophy, but the positive
That's a great
philosophy,
question.
you actually have the freedom to not take Christianity, and you can take Judaism instead.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't really have the answer to that question, but that it has to be true. I mean, there has to be some way in which this can happen in an entirely non-confessional, purely secular, or pluralistic sense, which I think is the same thing. But I do think there is a humanism here that we can't let go of. So I think while everything might be on the agenda, I think we are going to remain committed somehow to the human project in some very disturbingly conservative sense. So we're not going to, we're not going in a post-human or anti-human direction here. So insofar as your path leads you to the aspiration to work towards the unity of humanity and the dignity of humanity and the freedom of humanity, well then, you know, we're all on the same path. But there's no presupposition that everybody believes that, I guess. I mean, that's not Schelling's words, but I think that's something like what we'd have to say.
And the possibility for something better or something other, do you think that's also integral or
Yes,
inherent?
absolutely. Well, that would be the humanism, right? That somehow, couldn't we actually be a community? Do we have to war? Wouldn't it be possible to redistribute our resources so that we all have enough to eat and educate and so on? Is that a good idea? Is it impossible? Not logically, politically, but if that's the, you know, if that becomes, that telos is probably enough, actually. Just to work towards, it's not going to be utopia, but it'd be sure as hell a lot better than this. I don't think this word is a wonderful word, but you know, the situation.
And doesn't this point sort of to the idea of how, like, a Christian concept of Holy Spirit could meet with a sort of secular
Yes.
humanism?
Yeah.
Like, I might call that the presence of Holy Spirit or something, and you might
the
not,
Buddha.
but we're
The
still
Buddha
working
Maitreya.
towards something better.
It's really striking how much of this is in Buddhism. That was an eye-opener for me to see the very same narrative kind of working itself through Mahayana Buddhism, completely different way.
So we have a lineup. But, it's going to be Shannon, Benny, Thomas, and then Steve. So go ahead, Shannon.
Yeah, I had a different question than this, but just briefly about the humanism thing. Probably a humanism that would take seriously Heidegger's critique of humanism and say, make sure that you don't define the human beforehand. Like,
Yeah,
this
exactly.
emphasis on diversity is.
Every definition will be inadequate because it'll be based on the exclusion of someone who belongs there.
Yeah,
Even a
well,
machine who wakes up and says, hey, I can do stuff. I'm totally with that. So the human is not going to be defined a priori, on the contrary.
So
Anyway, I found this really helpful because I find Schelling difficult, so I appreciate it. Thank you. It was very interesting. I told myself I wasn't going to ask a question about Hegel because I don't want to entrench this. Some people do Hegel, some people do Schelling. But I'm going to ask a question about Hegel because I just want to. And it has to do with this issue of Christianity and. So you know, like you said, Hegel is sort of on the same page as Schelling here, seeing Christianity as the last religion, and then seeing that it sort of transforms into secularity. And the issue for Hegel is, so this will relate. I'll ask a question about history actually. The issue for Hegel is that Christianity like really identifies the need, the expression of God in the finite, so as a person. So that is a sort of not philosophical exactly, so it's not the highest form of recognition of this, but it's the recognition that the principle or the universal needs expression in the finite. So there's anything that's meaningful is this kind of tension between the universal and its expression. And that, for Hegel, is why the domain of history has such import, and this is why how I'm going to turn to the issue of history. You know, history is where you see principles enacted, and the tension between, I mean, there's a difficulty in enacting them, right? There's a difficulty in bringing the universal into being, and you're always going to do it in a kind of flawed way, and that's why the figure of conscience is the most, the apex for Hegel, at least in the phenomenology. The figure of conscience is the one who recognizes that the only way, you know, love is going to exist in the world is if she loves somebody, or the only way the good is going to exist is if she does something good, and in doing something good, she's going to do something bad at the same time. So, you know, for Hegel, history is never over because you can't fail to acknowledge the significance of the finite as the domain in which anything valuable or meaningful is expressed, you know, and that finite doesn't come to an end. So I just wonder, sorry to be long-winded, I just wonder how, you know, how this situation of love and diversity and so on would, you know, the fact that Schelling talks in terms of history, talks about history in those terms, would be related. Like, is there any commonality between these two in
Hegel and Schelling on that point?
Yeah, in relation to the significance of the finite.
Yeah, I think, first of all, I think that there are no two thinkers that are closer than the late Schelling and the mature Hegel. I think the Hegel of the encyclopedia. And I think Schelling actually did know that Hegel very well. So I think that they should obviously be studied side by side. And I hope we can do that at some point, particularly Hegel's philosophy of religion. So, and the other thing I would say then, and so this was clearly an effort to give to out-narrate Hegel, conceding that Hegel had undertaken the right thing. Now to out-narrate him, that would be one thing. But we could talk about the negative and the positive, and Hegel being an idealist and absorbing history into the idealism in the wrong kind of way. That would get a bit too technical. I think I see it much more simply. This is really about the Hegel-Schelling difference. I'm not even sure if that's the question, but Hegel and Schelling differ on logic, on the relationship of the universal to the individual, where for Hegel, they must be one, and their understanding of the two in separation from each other is abstract. And for Schelling, the Platonist, they never converge. So the dyad of universal and particular, which drives Plato into his wild theories and makes Plato a thinker of transcendence, that remains for Schelling as well. And it has all kinds of interesting ramifications vis-a-vis any kind of issue you'd like. So that would be one thing. The other thing is regarding the end of history. Well, the end of history, strictly speaking, has come to an end. History has come to an end in a sense as that it has achieved itself. And now what we have, this is for Hegel, now what we have, of course, is further confirmations of it, but we're not expecting something new. We're not expecting a new religion. Religion is over, and now it's for philosophy to no longer be the love of wisdom, but to be the science of knowledge, which now understands everything that has come forward. So I understand that you would like to deny there's an end of history for Hegel, but I think in a certain sense there has to be. It has achieved itself. It is over. And this is why that sentence that we read today is so important. We must not misunderstand our times. We must not misjudge our times, Schelling says. And I think this is the crux of their dispute, is that Schelling believes it hasn't happened. That what Hegel has jumped the gun, and he's pretending to know things that he can't know because that moment hasn't arrived yet. We're in a place of stagnation, still awaiting the kind of fullness that Hegel believes has already been achieved.